On February 25th, 1905, Jane Stanford, co-founder and patroness of Stanford University, was murdered, poisoned with strychnine, which is a terrible way to go. As to who would poison Jane Stanford and why, that is the subject of today's video. First, a note on the Stanfords. Leland Stanford, Jane's husband, moved to California to pursue gold, like so many did during the gold rush, and he failed at that, but he did find wealth. He opened up a general goods store for miners, and that made quite a pretty penny. And from there, he opened up a far larger venture in Sacramento. And from there, he made such a mighty fortune that when the Central Pacific Railroad was formed, he was one of the 4 principal investors. They became known as the Big Four, the rail barons of the West. He became titanically wealthy and extremely powerful. He soon was elected governor of California. Jane and Leland had one child, a son, and they lavished quite a lot on him. He died when he was a teenager, at which point Leland Stanford supposedly said that, "Then the children of California shall be our children." And they decided to open up a great university on the West, the very first of that. Previously, you had to go all the way to the East Coast to get a high education. They would give it to California. And they put into the project $40 million in the high Victorian era, which is equivalent nowadays, depending on which inflation tracker you use. If you measure it just as commodities, it would be about $1.25 billion. But if you measure it equivalent to wages, then it would be up to $11 billion. Quite a lot of money to put into such a project. When Leland died, Jane Stanford became the sole trustee of the university, and she micromanaged it a lot. She drove them a little bit nuts. But as far as she saw it, she paid for the university, she built it, it had her son's name on it. Its full name is actually Leland Stanford Junior University. One of her mansions is on the grounds. In fact, the entire campus is on the grounds of the Stanford Ranch. She felt quite fine with micromanaging it. It was her university. This, as I said, drove them nuts. And in 1903, she was finally persuaded to actually appoint a real board of trustees that wasn't literally just her as the sole trustee. But she retained the presidency for herself. And she continued running things. Dr. David Jordan was the president of the university, and it wasn't that pleasant for him. He'll be relevant in a minute. So, on the 14th of January 1905, Mrs. Stanford was in her ludicrous palace on Nob Hill in San Francisco, and drank some mineral water, which tasted unaccountably bitter. She spat it out, asked a few other servants to check. They found it to be incredibly bitter, just by that kind of test. She then decided to induce vomiting on herself because she'd concluded that she had been poisoned. This tells us something very important. This tells us that one of her first thoughts was, "I have been poisoned." And that says something about her position with regard to those around her. She contracts the best detective agency in San Francisco, in the West really, the Harry Morse Detective Agency, and has the bottle sent out for testing. It's concluded to contain a high amount of strychnine. At this point, the detective agency begins interviewing staff, and they find that her house is a hotbed of conspiracy. I'll go over the suspects in a minute. At any rate, Harry Morse can't determine who actually did it. She's deeply concerned, and she decides to abandon the whole palace in San Francisco, possibly California altogether, and she leaves. And she goes first on to Hawaii, at the beginning of a tour. She takes with her only her most trusted servants. After she has gone, news manages to break out in San Francisco that Mrs. Stanford, that someone had tried to poison her. At this point, Dr. David Jordan, head of the university, comes forth and assures the public that this scandalous thing you may have heard is totally not the case. She has gone to Hawaii for her health. The cold air and fog of San Francisco is disagreeing with her, and she has a cold, and she's decided to go to Hawaii. Perfectly normal, nothing to see here, folks. Well, when she's in Hawaii, she at one point has a stomachache, calls to her private secretary to bring her some bicarbonate of soda, which is basically Alka-Seltzer. That has a naturally bitter taste, and it masked any bitterness that there might have been. Unfortunately, the bottle of bicarbonate of soda had in fact been filled in San Francisco and had been inside the Nob Hill house. It was packed, I suppose, without thinking about it, which means that any of the servants could have had access to that bottle of bicarbonate of soda. Or it could have been one of the ones with her. At any rate, she quickly became extremely ill, was in terrible pain, and started screaming out for a doctor. Thankfully, there was a doctor staying in the same hotel on the same floor, and he arrived as quickly as you'd expect. He quickly realized that there was little he could do. He also called for more aid. When he realized there was nothing he could do, he started keeping notes. Extensive notes of what he saw. And what he describes in his notebook is unquestionably tetanic spasms caused by tetanus, where they have a long, slow onset of about a week, or by strychnine, when they come on relatively quickly, as they did. This basically means that the cause of death is solely strychnine. That's relevant for later. The doctor becomes afraid that someone might try to tamper with the things he sees around him in all the chaos and confusion, and he takes several of the items in the room, including the bicarbonate of soda and other items she might have had contact with very recently, and hides them in his room until the police get there, and then he gives them to them. They test the bicarbonate of soda and find it to contain strychnine. And there is an autopsy done on Jane Stanford. She died of strychnine. This was determined in a court, in fact. So you might think, well, that's pretty straightforward, strychnine poisoning. But I mentioned Dr. David Jordan, who previously disputed the whole attempted poisoning. Well, he wasn't going to have this now, was he? And he then sails to Hawaii as quickly as possible to arrange a cover-up. He hires a locally unscrupulous doctor, pays him a small fortune, in order to dispute the cause of death. Incidentally, he also, before even getting on the ship, issued a public statement that just from reading the news, he could tell she died of a heart attack. As though that makes sense. When he got there, big surprise, the doctor he hires says, no, she died of a heart attack, and disputes the local doctors. In fact, David Jordan disputes everything that happened locally. He casts aspersions against the local doctors. He insults this person and that person. He claims that the doctor who attended to her in the hotel may have actually poisoned the bicarbonate of soda himself, just for the police to see later. He then claims that there may even have been a conspiracy among all the officials who examined the body, which was 7 of them, 3 of whom had no relation at the time to the case. So that's not plausible. He also later denied saying that, which he did say. Dr. Jordan had heaps of motive, but very little actual opportunity. Presumably, if he was the murderer, he would have to work with someone on the inside. And that brings us to the question, who poisoned Jane Stanford? Now, I've mentioned Dr. David Jordan. Information on him comes from Professors Robert Cutler and Bliss Carnachan of Stanford University. They also note that that Mrs. Stanford had put spies on Jordan at the university. She had Professor Julius Goebel investigating his various controversies. And Goebel concluded and told Stanford that his his favoritism and political patronage were endangering university recruitment. Mrs. Stanford, according to Goebel, decided that that was it, and to fire Jordan. Goebel said this as much in a letter to a trustee at the time, a trustee of the university. So presumably he thought that was a done deal. Well, perhaps Jordan also knew that, because one of the first things he did when Jane Stanford died and he thus assumed full control of the university, one of the first things he did was fire Goebel, which indicates that he probably knew that he was spying for Stanford. In fact, David Starr Jordan actually began the process of firing Goebel in between the two poisonings. But of course, by the time it came to fruition, Mrs. Stanford was too dead to be able to do anything about it. During the course of his various lies, he changed his story a number of times, often in bizarre and highly inconsistent ways. So, for instance, he started out morally certain that the strychnine was added after her death by Dr. Humphreys, the doctor who responded on scene. Then he had to change it to there was no strychnine at all. In fact, Bertha Berner had also had some of the bicarbonate of soda and was fine. He eventually had to retract that statement as well, and then went to there was strychnine present, but only in tiny quantities, and it was a medicinal dose that was deliberately ingested. All of this is, of course, patently ludicrous. However, it can be a little bit explained by something he wrote to the new president of the Board of Trustees after Jane Stanford's death, Samuel F. Lieb. If the tonic theory of strychnine is not acceptable, you have the other, that it was put in by the doctor to bolster up his case after he had had time to read up on the symptoms a little. Then he added later, he's a man without professional or personal standing. And you might think, well, these lies are inconsistent and frankly dumb, that they wouldn't catch on. Unfortunately, they did. Information on the hotbed of conspiracy of the House comes from a local historian, June Morrill, who names some other suspects. The former butler, Albert Beverly. Albert Beverly outward appeared to care deeply for Mrs. Stanford, and he guided her and her personal secretary, Bertha Berner, on Stanford's many travels, and he seemed to care only for her needs in those times. However, he was in fact embezzling from her the whole time. One good reason to be with her was that every time she made any purchase of antiques or art or anything like that, he would then know the price and would write it into the house's accounts as 2 or 3 times as much as it actually costs. That's how much she would pay, and he would pocket the difference. Quite a substantial graft he was doing there. Now, according to Elizabeth Richmond, one of the maids, she was eventually confronted to say that everyone in the house knew that. At any rate, Bertha Berner knew, and she at one point did inform Mrs. Stanford. At the time, she tried to persuade her, they were in Australia, not to fire the butler while they were there. And so, it's not until they get back to California that there's then 2 disputed accounts of what happened. The public account is that he suddenly resigned, for reasons that are unclear. The more private account comes from a watchman on one of the Stanford estates, the one in Palo Alto, that's also the university. He said that Mrs. Stanford told him when she fired him that he and his family had to move out of the house they had been given on the Stanford University campus, the Stanford Ranch, and that was it. Be gone with you. The watchman then notes that the butler grew so angry that he broke one of the pipes in the house before he left so that it would partially flood and ruin a lot of things. So he was obviously a vengeful and angry sort as well, and clearly corrupt enough to have been stealing from her for a long time. But he wasn't in the house at that time. Neither was Dr. David Jordan. The second suspect is Elizabeth Richmond, maid I mentioned. She was an early suspect by the police, and they subjected both Elizabeth Richmond and former butler Albert Berkeley to extensive interrogations and got nothing, except that conclusion that Elizabeth Richmond finally told them that everyone knew. One reason that she was a suspect is that she had told many stories of servants poisoning lords and ladies. She was English. She was apparently very cold and formal. And the other reason is that she had an axe to grind. In between the two poisonings, Mrs. Stanford had given her a dress to repair. For whatever reason, it wasn't done, and Mrs. Stanford went back to her to order it be done. At this point, Elizabeth Richmond flashed with such anger that Mrs. Stanford fired her. Not knowing where to go, she then moved in with the former butler temporarily. So you've got the disgraced angry maid and the disgraced corrupt butler living together in one spot. Then there's Ah Wing, the housekeeper. He and Bertha Burner had been serving Mrs. Stanford for a very long time, and according to the family, they were both utterly loyal and beyond suspicion. But the family also thought, when she said she was poisoned the first time, that she was just being paranoid, so who knows if we can listen to their account. At any rate, when Jane's brother Harry died, Ah Wing told Jane that Harry had promised him $1,000. Jane Stanford gave it to him, gave him $1,000. In the high Victorian era, that's a lot of money. A lot of money. The other servants all suspected he was lying. There are also an additional maid, houseboy, 2 cooks, and a temporary butler, none of whom got any real suspicion, other than being petty, jealous, and full of conspiracy. But the other main suspect is Bertha Burner, her private secretary, the only person present at the time of both poisonings. She had been with her a very long time, and was quite comfortable and well paid. She seemed to have a happy life with Mrs. Stanford. She was treated more as a companion or even a guest than a servant. And Mrs. Stanford told at one point the other servants to obey her. This caused immense resentment. The other servants really seemed to hate her for it. She and Ah Wing did not get along either, partially stemming from that same reason. There were rumors, again, the house is full of rumors, that Bertha Burner had threatened to quit multiple times, and that it wasn't until one of Jane's brothers offered her a separate secret salary to stay on that she did so. But of course, those could be the jealous rumors of others in the house. It's very difficult to say. According to that local historian I mentioned, in between the two poisonings, Burner was informed that she and all the other servants had been written out of the will. So perhaps beforehand you could say that she may have expected to inherit money, and afterwards you could say it was an act of vengeance. That's one conclusion you could reach. At any rate, if she was informed that, it wasn't true, because she was left $15,000 in Mrs. Stanford's will. The other servants all got $1,000 apiece. Bertha Burner proved to be a fabulously unreliable witness. She issued 2 other accounts later in life, both of which contradicted each other and the earlier account. Her later accounts only served to confirm Dr. Jordan's obvious lie. They're fanciful stories at best. Bizarrely, the cover-up was actually successful, and when the police failed to come up with who the killer was, they chose to go with the heart attack idea. And Dr. David Starr Jordan had enough traction with the press that he managed to get that out there, and it stuck. And that was the cause of death that you would find anywhere that you read about her for most of a century. And it wasn't until the end of the 20th century that a few historians started looking into what happened and finding the facts to be quite clear. She was poisoned. But of course, thanks to that ludicrous cover-up, the murderer got away with it. Who killed Jane Stanford? History, unfortunately, doesn't tell us. But it does give us a lovely list of suspects and some magnificent intrigue, together with an Agatha Christie-level strychnine poisoning murder. Good old masterpiece theater stuff. If you didn't know that the co-founder and patroness of Stanford University was poisoned like an Agatha Christie novel, now you know. Hope you found it interesting. There, be sure to like and subscribe for more of the fantastical stories that history is full of. There are going to be more, and they're all, every one of them, going to be completely awesome. See you then.